Hi, everyone. This is Joe Hage. I have the privilege of leading your medical devices group, which, as of this recording, has 353,000 members worldwide. And one of the reasons I think we've grown as large as we have is we have members like Carlos who are willing to share their expertise with the group. And there certainly seems to be a lot of demand for information about supply chain management and operational excellence. And I went and found the smartest guy I could find to give that presentation. He wasn't available, so I asked Carlos. Little joke there. Anyhow, I'm going to put myself on mute, and Carlos, have a good show. I will show up at the end and read off the questions. You're welcome to ask questions as you have them, and we'll read them at the end. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone. I do appreciate you taking the time to tune into this webinar. I hope that you find it informative and are able to take some of the things that you learn here today and apply them in your own work. Today's webinar is on the topic of cost reduction and why it is as important to the medical devices executives as other initiatives such as marketing and sales campaigns. And to do this, we need to explore how CEOs think so that we can best communicate our case for cost reduction. I believe one reason that we don't do a good job communicating with the C-suite is because we are not able to express things in a way in which they will listen and take us seriously. So this webinar is about learning one way to be able to communicate with the C-suite, and furthermore, position you as a resource to be trusted. So in consulting circles, there's an exercise called value analysis. And what value analysis is simply is taking your balance sheet and your net income statement, looking over the past 5 years, and trying to understand sort of some trends and ratios. One of the first things we try to understand is the EBITDA, right? So I'm going to talk about EBITDA, what it is, and why is it important to the C-suite. I'd also like to make sure that each of you understand how your contributions, as small as you think they may be, do impact EBITDA. I will briefly discuss a few other metrics that collectively paint a picture so that you can see how your contributions can make an impact. Those will include enterprise value and return on invested capital, or ROIC. Finally, I'll leave behind a few tools that you can begin to use right now to help you start thinking about ways to identify key issues, develop some hypotheses, and formulate initiatives that'll help you resolve some of those key issues. So I wanted to start by level setting on the size of the medical devices market. Right now, we currently stand at approximately $360 billion and are projected to grow to $435 billion by the year 2020, and that represents a compounded annual growth rate of 6.4%, which is quite healthy and very nice. The U.S. is approximately 40 to 43% of the total global market, and from a recent consensus, the most recent consensus in 2012, employed about 350,000 people at over 5,800 establishments, and their salaries are approximately 15% over the national average. So clearly doing more than its fair share for the economy here. Finally, we do have a little bit more import than we do in export. I think the biggest takeaway here really is that given the size of this industry, small incremental changes can have a huge impact, especially if it's taken globally. And that includes in your own business. Okay. Now, what really got me thinking about this topic are the things I would hear at my clients that led me to realize the supply chain doesn't do a great job communicating the value of their contribution clearly in the medical devices space. And I would often hear cases against chains that didn't make sense to me. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is the consequences is that some of these issues that need to be resolved really don't ever get resolved until it's much too late. And at that point, you're bringing in consultants like myself to help you. And I'd like to see if we could, collectively as a community, be able to start pressing the supply chain case in the medical devices space a little bit more, and helping resolve those issues earlier. So to illustrate this, I gathered some quotes that I've heard personally and often, and I believe they will resonate with you as well. So let's see here. The first one is, I don't care about inventory costs. We sell these at an 80+% profit margin. This is from a medical devices marketing executive. Clearly, the project was to help with inventory costs. We were getting some pushback from this. Same client, same project, but a little bit different person in the organization. The opportunity cost of losing a sale is 80+%. So I would rather sacrifice higher inventory levels to make sure we get the sale. So this kind of means really to me a bit of a cultural position on where inventory management is, particularly as it pertains to the sales and marketing team, which carries a lot of weight in medical devices. Switching gears a little bit, we've been with this vendor for 20 years, and they're the only ones who know our business. This coming from a business line executive, clearly a little bit protective about an important stakeholder, collaborator in the person's business, right? But resistant to change. I know I'm getting the best price because I asked for 3 bids and picked the lowest one, coming from a business line manager who, albeit is executing some procure-to-pay processes as best they can, but really probably over leveraging a particular technique for trying to get the best price and find the best vendors. And then this last one, I know most of you have heard, if not once, but many times, I'm not sure why I process warranties this way. It's the way I've always processed them. That's from a warranty manager. And I have warranties in bracket because really you can kind of, insert your own process here, right? Is it a purchase order that's being processed? Could it be a return or a rebate or discount or claims, right? These processes, they're established and they're often not challenged. So what I realized was that the supply chain managers were just not communicating their case for change very well. And I thought one of the most important lapses is communication was the ability to communicate in a language of the CEO or the CFO or anyone else in a C-suite for that matter. So let's start by looking at what is EBITDA. EBITDA is an acronym for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It is a measure of profitability, and there are several measures of profitability. There's the gross margin, which takes into account the cost of goods sold. And so this is essentially a pro forma company I made up, $100 million with $20 million in cost of goods sold to get an $80 million gross margin, trying to really sort of illustrate the same types of quotes that I was hearing before. Then we have EBITDA. EBITDA takes into account sales, general and administrative. It also has R&D in there, though it's rarely highlighted. And this is essentially, sales, marketing, but your overhead as well. And then the last one, which is very commonly known as net income. Net income takes into account interest, taxes, and some non-cash expenses such as depreciation and amortization. If you have a positive EBITDA, then you're selling a product at a price that covers the cost of goods sold, covers your SG&A and your overhead, without having non-operationally focused expenses like interest or taxes. So the executive team, with the help of bankers, are going to negotiate interest rates or determine how to finance operations. Some of that could be including issuing bonds. Supply chain executives aren't really responsible for that, right? Taxes are the realm of accountants, and supply chain execs have little to do with decisions around the structure of a company or deductions and things of that nature. Supply chain execs do have a lot to say on capital expenditures on plant and equipment, but they don't have a lot to say on how that's expensed. So depreciation and amortization expenses are subject to decisions made by a CFO or the controller or tax accountants that impact that number. So for example, they determine what the useful life is. If you buy a piece of equipment, are you going to depreciate it for 5 years or 10 years, right? Huge impact on whatever that D&A number is. Also the method for depreciation. Are they going to front load some of those expenses in an accelerated format, or are they going to do a straight line where they take the number and they just kind of apply it over the years that they've determined are the useful life? And then of course, at the back end, there's the salvage value. There's some value that they're really making a guess on now. None of these measure how well a business is actually being run. However, when we do look at return on invested capital, you'll see how PP&E does impact performance. So we're not going to ignore it, but we're just going to sort of put it on the side at this point in time. So all of this, again, without the distortion of capital structure, tax rates, depreciation, and schedules. So every CEO and CFO will know what their EBITDA is, and they will know all the different details that make it up. So if they know it, then it's important to you too. Okay. So how do you grow EBITDA, right? There are only 2 ways to grow EBITDA. You sell more or you grow the margin, okay? selling more is straightforward. If same price for the unit, you sell 10% more, margin will stay the same. You'll come up with $77 million. This is in my pro forma sort of illustration here. Secondly, you can grow the margin, and there are two ways to grow the margin. You can increase the price, or you can lower the cost of goods. Okay, for you to maintain the same revenue by increasing the price, you actually would end up selling less. This kind of makes sense. You increase the price, you're going to lose some people. In this case, you can still come up with the same amount of margin. Likewise, you could keep the price the same, sell the same number of units, but reduce the cost of goods sold, reduce the SG&A, and you could come up again with the same amount, right? So these are all different ways in which you can grow the market, the EBITDA and contribution towards that. Another concept I'm going to introduce here is called the enterprise value. The enterprise value is the cash equivalent one can expect if they were to sell the company today. It is made up of quite a number of things, but really most importantly, it's made up of market cap plus long-term debt plus short-term debt, right? So what does this mean? This really means if you were to go out and literally buy all of the shares outstanding, you would own the company. You would also own the long-term debt and the short-term debt. So essentially, it's telling you how much cash an owner might receive if they were to sell the company today. And this is an important concept we're going to have to keep in mind as we go forward. Okay, so I put together a table here sort of to help illustrate, what is kind of the norm, really, right? I have here the top 18 medical devices companies. I have their enterprise value. I have their 2017 revenues, their 2017 EBITDA, and I've calculated the margins, which is essentially EBITDA over revenue, and I've also calculated the EBITDA multiple. What the multiple says is it tells you how many times of the EBITDA you will get to arrive at the enterprise value, right? 20 times 6.1 billion is going to give you 124.8 billion in Abbott Laboratories case. We'll get into why that's extraordinarily important. I think one of the things to keep in mind right now is if you just kind of scan up and down the margins, right, you're not going to find a whole lot of 80 to 90% or 70 to 80% margin companies. They're all in the 20 to 30. There's a few that's 35 and 36 here, right? But much lower than what you might hear from someone who's trying to convince you that, well, the margins are way too high on these products. Most likely that's coming because it could be you only sell one product, right? All of these companies here clearly have a much wider portfolio of companies, right? So interestingly enough, if there are some 80 to 90%, SKUs or product families, then there's probably some, 5, 10, or 15% products if you're going to arrive in the 20 to 30% range. So keep that in mind, right? The other thing I want to highlight here is I've kind of summed all of these figures. We have almost 700 billion in enterprise value. The total of 133 billion is, in fact, you take that over of the 360 billion that we saw earlier, and that's where you come up with 1/3. This is essentially 1/3 of the global market right here on this table. And here we have the EBITDA. We can calculate a weighted average EBITDA with this line here, and we come up with 24.7%, right? Almost 25%. And the weighted average multiple is 21%, okay? So for me, when I look at this, I say, particularly in some of these, there's actually quite a bit of room for cost reduction. And that's kind of what I would like to focus on. Okay, one other thing to keep in mind is that as you contribute to the EBITDA, you can actually grow the multiplier. Now, the multiplier, and I won't get into it because it's statistical analysis essentially, but there's a lot of things that contribute to what the multiplier is. It's not just EBITDA, it's the revenue, it's taxes, it's all of these different things. But EBITDA is an important one, right? So if you can improve your EBITDA, then you can improve the multiple. Growing the EBITDA margins grow the multiple, okay? And oh, by the way, one more piece on this. This little insight here, in fact, not a lot of people know about this, actually. In fact, your CFO may know it, but it may not be top of mind. So part of what I'm trying to say is let's try to remind and communicate in a way in which, when they hear these things, they're going to start going, you're right. This is a good initiative because it's going to grow my EBITDA and I'm going to get a multiple off of it. And my multiplier might even multiply. And that is when you start really getting the interest and establishing yourself as a trusted advisor to the C-suite. So we can look at some scenarios to kind of understand what this all means, right? We said prior that we have a 25% weighted average EBITDA. What does that mean? If your sales team were to sell $100,000 in sales, or maybe a million or 10 million, whatever the case may be, they're going to contribute 25,000 in EBITDA. If you're able to reduce costs by $100,000, you're going to generate $100,000 in EBITDA, right? So you would literally need to sell 4 times whatever the number is for every single dollar in cost savings, either through price reduction or efficiencies. And and then likewise, if you have a 21 multiple in EBITDA, and this is where they really get excited, and you're to save 100,000 in EBITDA contribution, it's the equivalent of 2.1 million in enterprise value. Okay. I've never heard anybody ever start communicating in this way. It's always, this is what we're going to save. Well, stop a moment and think about that. You're going to save this much to the EBITDA, but what does that mean from the enterprise value? It is 21 times that, right? So the cash equivalent is always going to be some X times whatever the EBITDA is, 21 in this case. And then this last piece here is sort of what I had explained earlier. You grow EBITDA, and then you will, for every X percent of EBITDA that you grow, you'll make some Y percent contribution to expanding the multiplier. This is very difficult to prove with hard data. In fact, I went and looked for it, couldn't find specifically for medical devices. I did find it for other industries. If you're interested, I can share that, but I didn't want to include something that really wasn't relevant here. So, but it in fact does happen. So point being, communicate the cash equivalent impact on the enterprise value, as well as the expanded multiple to the C-suite, not just the EBITDA. Okay. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit now and move on to focusing on how what you do is going to impact EBITDA and return on invested capital. I said we were going to talk about ROIC a little bit. Here we are. ROIC is the net operating profit after taxes divided by invested capital. Okay, and NOPAT is essentially EBITDA as well as taxes, which we're not going to talk about today. Invested capital is your PP&E and working capital, as well as effectively what is interest. But essentially, it's interest on debt as well as the return that you're expected from your shareholder equity is expecting. We're not going to talk about that either. Okay, but this is effectively a map that you can use and should use to help you understand how the things you do actually impact EBITDA and impact ROIC. So I've included some of the variables that make this up. To get to revenue, you have a price times the volume or the quantity that you sell. Cost of goods sold are equal to the cost of the material, whatever the overhead may be, and some labor to convert that to a finished good. SG&A, sales and marketing, and all that kind of good stuff. In working capital, you'll see inventory is in there. You'll also see accounts receivable and accounts payable. Now, I have also included just a sampling, really, of initiatives that you as supply chain professionals can think about and how they would roll up into the EBITDA or the ROIC. It's not comprehensive. There's clearly a lot more, but I sort of wanted to give you guys a sense of, if you are somewhere trying to reduce the cost of goods sold through maybe a strategic sourcing initiative, then you will see where it rolls up. If you're trying to, reduce inventory, develop an inventory pull system that will help you do that, then you'll see kind of how that rolls up. I did want to kind of highlight a couple that I think are really interesting because people don't think about this very much, but operations executives can really help even with revenue growth, with top line growth. I had a client once who had a revenue leakage issue. They were a subscription business, really, and people would sign up using their credit cards, sign an application, and enjoy the services. They had an issue with a lot of people kind of, I guess, regretting the purchase and then coming back to dispute it through the credit card company. The issue is that this client couldn't provide the evidence in time to be able to counter that dispute. Ultimately, the credit card would rule in favor of the customer versus the client. So with some operational excellence kind of methodologies, we help streamline the process. We help make that information available more readily, and they began to win those cases and grow the revenue. Another piece that's really very impactful is streamlining the NPL, being the new product launch process. Typically very much a marketing and sales driven initiative. However, if you are able to actually accelerate that, if you think about what that revenue curve is going to look like, it's actually quite high. If you can move it forward 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months, I mean, you could be talking about tens of millions of dollars. So, and the other thing I wanted to kind of show is that all of these different initiatives kind of be conveniently grouped into three sort of supply chain disciplines: supply chain strategy, operations excellence, and procurement strategy. Now, if we're to look at those three disciplines, I have here a few of the initiatives that we talked about that sort of relate to those disciplines. Excuse me. From a supply chain strategy, consolidating your plant, warehouse, or service network is clearly right in the bailiwick there. Continuing digitizing your supply chain, sales and operations planning. From the procurement strategy piece, right, spend analytics, aggregate your spend, conducting strategic sourcing initiatives, improving supplier performance, consolidating the vendor base. And then from an operations excellence, we've got the two that I had mentioned before, but clearly standardizing processes to improve efficiencies is right there within the realm of this discipline, and increasing latent capacity, to essentially, get more from what it is that you have. Operations excellence started on a plant floor and is now just growing, well beyond that into business processes and services. Okay, so when you're thinking about the initiatives you want to do, make sure you're thinking kind of what are all the disciplines, and where is it that we think we can kind of drive some incremental value. But I would also add that some of the best solutions are where you look at sort of the shaded areas where they intersect. Okay, and so if you were to look at the supply chain strategy and procurement strategy, one of the things that I've done that was extraordinarily successful is leveraging the procurement group and their processes to help you rationalize your network. You're rationalizing your network means looking at the demand, looking at your footprint, obviously consolidating around demand better. Inevitably, vendors drop off and potentially new vendors come in. It's a great opportunity to swap out a poor performing vendor. It's a great opportunity to update contract terms, standard operating procedures. All of these things can be done together where you have your strategic analysis of what the network should be, your new supply chain, and then you have your procurement group that can fit, early on in the process and really help you drive that savings to the bottom line. Similarly, we can look at supply chain strategy and operations excellence. Implementing demand signaling is, clearly an operations excellence, almost core business, core capability is the ability to visualize and see where things are happening. So introducing that into supply chain strategy, streamlining the S&OP process. Vendor managed inventory, in fact, is quite old, but is a classic example of this, right? It's really eliminating a lot of what was being done on one side of the wall and allowing the vendor to come in, shares a lot of that work, so that all you really need to focus on is pulling that inventory off the shelf and let them kind of fulfill, which is something they would have had to done anyway. So, and I know and hope that many of you are going to be at the Medical Devices 10X conference, and at the first week of April, I will be there to have a presentation on procurement excellence. That is this space here, and I'm going to talk about really ways in which you can take operational excellence methodologies, apply them in what I think are some obtuse procurement processes to come up with the streamlined processes. And we'll look at how you can select purchasing strategies. We'll look at optimizing resources to task and eliminating wasted effort, and leveraging data analytics. So think in the shared spaces so that you can come up with some more comprehensive solutions to the issues your organization is facing. We're going to transition to the tools here, but I wanted to sort of just give you my thoughts on sort of what a high-level transformation roadmap looks like. If you have in need of a real transformation essentially in your operations, this is probably where you're going to begin. And I do this because not because I'm suggesting you need to do this, but it's just spaces where you can look for opportunities. One of the things I find often is companies don't necessarily have their strategies aligned. Your business strategy may be to address a particular market, but your procurement team and your procurement strategy, or even your manufacturing, is really designed for something else. That happens a lot. And when you start poking around in there and asking some questions, inevitably you're going to come up with some sort of ideas that are just, really transformational. So not suggesting you have to do all of this, but just think about that particular space. When you go into an assessment, right, you're going to look at all of these different opportunities. You're going to look at the current state and the future state, right? You're going to design the future state, right? So this is where you're kind of getting into, what do we want things to look like? And between here and there are all of your gaps, and all of those just really turn right into initiatives. Initiatives roll into the roadmap, and then of course you begin implementing and measuring your successes. And then finally, I hope everyone is always thinking about continuous improvement. You almost inevitably never get it right the very first time anyways, and things change so often. So this is an extraordinarily important piece to kind of maintaining your just excellence. Okay, so I'm going to get into probably one of the most powerful tools is the hypothesis-driven approach. This is an approach that was designed by top-tier firms, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, and what it was really meant was to come up with an answer quickly without the ability to do all extensive data and analysis. But it really is a great way for you to generate a whole bunch of ideas for improvement. And so it starts with a well-defined problem statement, right? Reminds me of a quote from Einstein, right? He said, if the world was going to end in 60 minutes, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. So a well-written problem statement is very, very important to have. Then you come up with a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement of fact that says, if you do this, X, Y, and Z will happen, regardless if you know that's true or not right now. And there can be multiple hypotheses per the problem statement, but I'm just going to go through one right here. Hypotheses effectively are filled with assumptions, and that's what the next level is, documenting what you think those primary assertions are. Now, an assertion means this has to be true for the hypothesis to be true, right? And all three in this case would have to be true for the hypothesis to be true. There could be secondary and tertiary assertions. Those are some very huge problems, but for the most part, you probably don't have to get too detailed. And then from here, you say, what is the specific piece of data that I need to help prove that primary assertion and ultimately the hypothesis, okay? So what are the benefits of doing this? First, you don't have to boil the ocean to help prove something. By doing this, you actually focus on the specific data you need, right? And you can use the 80-20 rule here. You don't have to be 100% correct. If you've got enough information to suggest your hypothesis right, your hypothesis is right. But that's one of the primary benefits. And then the other benefit is when we step back and think about this for a moment, what are you doing? You're getting some of the smartest people in a room together to come up with all of these different ideas. You don't need to boil the ocean to prove what you think to be right. Everyone kind of has a good sense already anyways. So let's put that down on paper and let's make sure that we're actually, right about what our assumptions are. That's effectively what you're doing. So I really like this approach. A lot of people use a brainstorming exercise for this. And I've done a lot of brainstorming exercises. I've always kind of felt like they get about 70 to 80% there, but there's some things that just seem to be missed. It never felt like we were really thinking, innovatively, right? And so this kind of bothered me, and I helped develop this thing, or created this thing called the Value Accelerator Workshop. And what the Value Accelerator Workshop does is take the senior executives through an experience going to evaluate other business models very far outside of what their industry is, and really make them kind of uncomfortable, frankly, to be in maybe a retail space when you're in medical devices. What do you know about women's fashion? Probably nothing, right? So making you think about retail and women's fashion, and some of the tools that they could be potentially using, really kind of gets your juices flowing a little bit. And then you're challenged to help take some of those things back, right? These are paradigms, disrupting ideas. You take them back and try to apply them. It's a great exercise. Ultimately, the output is a benefit matrix, which tells you sort of all the initiatives you come up, what you think the cost is or the benefit from it, as well as some level of effort or a risk, as well as the roadmap. But I think from having done this, one of the greatest sort of feedback I got was how the team really felt aligned against an objective and motivated to kind of really, when they leave the workshop, go out and start making these great changes. So just keep that in mind. There's ways to kind of really kind of get some additional incremental value that way. One of my favorite tools is the SciPoc. Okay. SIPOC is used to quickly come up with a scope to the extent of your issues. It's also used to help you kind of go from an end-to-end process, and I'll get into that a little bit on the next slide. But essentially what this is, it's an acronym for supplier inputs, processes, outputs, and customers. You begin with the process, and you can put all different types of processes. You can have, order to cash in there potentially, or maybe even it is the process of a purchase order, or processing, an invoice, something of that nature. That's what you would put in the process here. And then you begin from the center outwards, and you understand what are the inputs I need to actually do this process, or what are the inputs that go into this process. Likewise, you can think about what are the outputs that are a result of this process that I'm doing. Taking that a little bit further, you understand who are the ones who are actually creating these inputs, and who are the customers or the consumers of the output that I actually create, okay? Now, how do you really kind of get step change ideas from this? When you take the SIPOC upstream and downstream, it allows you to kind of identify more ideas. If you are in this process here in the middle, and you are producing this output, and you are consuming this input, in fact, is an output of another process, okay? And by working with the owners of that process, which, by the way, in this instance would actually be let's see, this supplier here, excuse me. By working with this supplier who does this process, you could streamline activities and efforts and just take them completely out of the process. So that's one really nice way to do it. The other way is you can go downstream, right? You can start talking to your customers who consume your input and ask them some basic questions. What do you use this for? Do you even still need it? There's been several times where, I've heard customers, consumers downstream kind of say, I didn't know you did that. I didn't even know you produced that report, right? And it's like, well, you've been doing it for quite some time, okay? These are the types of things you discover when you start thinking about processes from an end-to-end perspective. Now, another good example of a reason to use a SIPOC is, it doesn't take a lot of time. If you know your process and some of the inputs and outputs, you could probably put it all down in half an hour to 45 minutes. This is not a process mapping exercise where you have 1,000 different Post-it notes up on the wall. This is something that you can put on a sheet of paper, okay? And you can write it down, maybe an Excel spreadsheet. If you want to spend a couple hours doing some interviews to fill it out a little bit further and just get a little bit more richness, I certainly encourage that. It should not take you 8 hours by any stretch of the imagination. This is something that you can really do pretty quickly, scope whatever the initiative is, and start identifying what some of those opportunities are going to be for making improvements. So I really like the SIPOC. Let's see. The last piece I'm going to leave you with is is understanding the essence of Lean Six Sigma, which is going to help you identify other opportunities that I don't think most people would be able to see. So my definition of of Lean Six Sigma is eliminating waste by focusing on those things that delight the customer. So there's two pieces to that: focus on the customer and identify and remove the waste. By focusing on the customer, we focus on what is the value that we bring, right? And there's three types of value. There's customer value add, business value add, and non-value add, okay? Customer value add is whether the customer is willing to pay for it, and the key being if they knew you were doing it, right? So they have to know you're doing it, and if they're willing to pay for it, then it's valuable to them. Any task that add form, feature, or function, of course, you're producing a product, you have to do those things, or enables a competitive advantage. Business value add are tasks required by law or FDA regulation, which you'll find quite a bit of in medical devices, right? Or that reduce owner financial risk, right? So almost like an insurance policy, probably worth doing if it's going to save you from some, catastrophic downside. Of course, if you remove the process or task or whatever, and it breaks down production or selling processes, then you probably don't want to, eliminate those. Non-value add essentially is everything that doesn't fall into the prior two buckets. But a nice litmus test to ask is if the customer would pay for what you were doing if they knew you were doing it, and if they wouldn't, then it's not a value add. And it's really interesting how you get into a lot of conversations about our customer demands this and demands that, and you end up doing so much to provide for your customer. But if you were really to pull them aside and say, do you know that we're doing X, Y, and Z, and if you were to take something that had maybe a little bit less, we'd save you the money, be like, yeah, saving the money. That happens actually quite a bit. The last piece here is identifying and removing waste. in Lean Six Sigma, they've come up with a very nice acronym. It used to be called Tim Wood, but now it's Tim R. Wood because they've included resources in here. And they each represent something like transportation, inventory, motion, resources, waiting, overproduction, overprocessing, and defects. I know many of you are going to sit there and look at this list and say, well, transportation, you can't get rid of transportation at all. Well, that's true, but not in all cases, right? But you could reduce transportation. You could eliminate half of the transportation. That's value that you're bringing, right? And keep in mind, there's now technology out there, right, that may allow you to eliminate entirely. 3D printing. I can now manufacture something way over there. I don't have to do it here and send it, right? Classic example. How about your phone bill or your credit card bill? I'm shipping paper to your house, you're writing a check, shipping it to the bank. That's transportation that now with online payment is completely eliminated. So before you start poo-pooing the idea you can't get rid of transportation, give it a shot. I'm going to quickly go through some other ones. Resources I want to talk about because a lot of people think of Lean Six Sigma as a headcount thing. I think that's kind of unfair. It is more of, unfortunately, a consequence, and typically means the company isn't growing fast enough to absorb the additional capacity. But one thing to look at is if you have a manager, for example, doing work of an associate, and a director doing work of a manager, and a VP doing work of a director, then that's inefficient, right? You really want to get manager doing manager's work, director doing director's work, and so on and so forth. Some of you can relate to this. By doing that, you will eliminate inefficiencies, okay? Of course, some people argue, well, why don't you have a manager doing director's work, director doing VP? And that's true. That's definitely optimizing your return. But, I kind of believe in fair pay, fair compensation, and recognition for your work. Other things here, overproduction and overprocessing. This on a manufacturing plant is typically if you've got an order for 450 units, you decide you're gonna make 500 because well, the setup time takes so much. We'll just produce some more and put it on the shelf. Lots of people make that type of decision. It's waste. You don't have to do that. You shouldn't do that. Overprocessing, you see a lot of that in the in services or even business processes. But some examples could be your budget that you produce. Spend tens and hundreds of hours producing a budget that maybe you only need a few figures for. Meetings are a classic example of this. If you're in a meeting, you have 10 people, 3 to 4 are really the ones necessary. The other ones may have only needed to be there for 5 minutes or so. That's actually a form of overprocessing and waste. So if you eliminate that type of effort, you can actually generate some value. And then finally, defects and rework. The Six Sigma of Lean Six Sigma is essentially around quality improvement. So defects are extraordinarily expensive. You put all this time, money into a product and it's broken, you have to rework it or throw it away. So clearly fixing that would be beneficial. So I wanted to share some parting thoughts. So for you to be able to really convince your C-suite of not only the value of the initiatives you bring to the table, but also position yourself as a trusted advisor to the C-suite, you have to understand the issues that are most important to them and have those on your mind at all times. You have to understand how what you do directly contributes to your improvement issues, and you have to communicate those in a way that's going to resonate with the C-suite. So use EBITDA, talk about the multiple, and communicate savings and enterprise value, not just absolute value. I would also highly encourage you to go to your investor relations site, download the most recent 10K, annual 10K, and spend probably most of your time formatting a terribly formatted Excel spreadsheet so that you have 5 years of your balance sheet and net income, and you do just basic, changes in revenue, looking at changes in revenue or basic ratios, and looking at those over time. That's going to really tell you pretty much what the CEO is thinking. I'm going to have to reduce inventory costs or overhead costs, or I'm going to have to increase revenues, right? Having that understanding is really going to give you insight into the C-suite. And then finally, use the tools that are provided, know how you will be growing EBITDA and improving ROIC. So with that, Joe, I will send it over to you. If there are any questions out there.
You bet there are, and that was a really solid job. Thank you, Carlos. I really appreciated that, and I learned a lot from you as well.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump ahead of everybody, because I have the mic, and ask, you mentioned templates. Are there some templates that you use and you can make available to the people on this call? Is that something you charge for, or is there something out there that you can just share? Because it sounds as though, the Excel spreadsheets and the like, you say that everyone's going to be looking for. I'm thinking you've done it before and you'd save them a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, as far as some of the value analysis, I mean, those are kind of built on a case by case basis. What you see right here is a template. So this is something that's included in the presentation. There are also, I can share a template of the SciPoc. That's very easy to do. I can share a template of the hypothesis driven approach as well. So, and I'll maybe what I'll do is even put some examples. I'll make sure they're sanitized so that you
Okay.
can kind of see how it develops essentially. But yeah, I can certainly share some templates.
Okay, if you get that to me today, then I can send out an email and send it out to everybody.
Okay.
Um, Matteo in Switzerland has been very patient. He writes, I'm running a division of a connectivity company. Our disruptive technology can be applied to many medical devices such as diagnostic imaging and CRM. He wants to know what is the supply chain strategy among OEMs, electronic service manufacturers, and multinational companies. Do you have a perspective on that?
What is their supply chain strategy?
He says the supply chain strategy between the multinationals and their suppliers. How do you choose them?
Hmm.
And usually, what is the bargaining power of the supplier?
Okay, you're taking the perspective from the supplier's position. Yeah, so a lot of these have sophisticated procurement departments, and they will, especially for strategic categories, components to units or even finished goods, they will be very sophisticated about the way in which they try to approach. And what they'll do is essentially try to create a competitive environment, right? From the supplier perspective, I've always kind of recommended that they collaborate with the OEMs as best as possible, because you want to be able to differentiate yourself from the other suppliers. And being able to help them with their issues is one way in which you can kind of do that. But overall, if you have a differentiating product, you're in a much better position than obviously a commodity like office supplies, right? But if you have a particular medical device or component that will turbocharge, the finished good in one way or the other, then you are in a much better position, and you should rightfully, defend your position against, what some people may be trying to get you to kind of push your pricing on. So.
Thank you. And Matteo, if you have a follow-up question, I'll be sure to get it to him after the presentation. Mark
Absolutely.
asks, are you familiar with Kepner Trago, and is the Value Accelerator kind of a repackaging of that?
No, I'm not familiar with Kepner Trago. Never heard
Okay.
it before, but I'll
He
take a look at it.
he tells me that that is a problem-solving and decision-making process developed in the 1960s that essentially does exactly what you're talking about, and it's not new to Six Sigma people who have, I guess, learned about it before.
Okay,
And so you might want to take a look at that.
I will.
Next, it's from a personal friend of mine, Feroz, and I worked together at Cardiac Science. He was our VP of manufacturing and operations. And he asks, are there existing cloud-based platforms which address the items at the intersection of the Venn diagrams in slide 19? So if you want to scroll back to slide 19.
Slide 19. Get to
Two more. There you go.
this one here.
Yes.
Are they cloud-based? Actually, right here in the procurement excellence space, there are some cloud-based solutions such as Coupa. That's a very good one. Zycus, I believe, also offers. These are kind of P2P type solutions, and they, in fact, do take a lot of waste kind of out of the traditional procurement processes. So I'm actually going to speak a little bit about that as well, because I find that oftentimes people just feel like you have to go take categories through these comprehensive sourcing processes, when in fact you probably don't have to do that. And some of these solutions make things very easy now, especially now with artificial intelligence. You can get to spend analytics extraordinarily quickly. You don't have to go through weeks of analysis. All those types of things are starting to be not only integrated, but in fact they're maturing to a level where they're very effective. So. Of course, here you're probably running into WMS systems, which are now moving to the cloud as well, and you'll definitely get some you'll see some solutions in there.
Nice. And Feroz writes, very well thought out approach, and he writes on a very solid presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Arthur from Sacramento asks, what happens if you work for a privately held company where there are no public filings to calculate EBITDA?
Yes, this is actually a quite difficult one, and to some degree, I feel for folks who are trying to get really good data in this space. And there are a lot in the medical devices industry. A lot of companies are just privately held. They're small to medium size. They haven't gone public. There are actually quite a few different things you can do. I don't know that any of them are as ideal as having the data from a public filing, but you can try to look at peers, your competitors, and see, at least from a percent perspective, what are their EBITDA margins. You can try to look at what are the multiples there. You can try to kind of go old school consulting and create from ground up what you think might be the revenue base and what you think might be the cost of goods. But there's also an even easier way to do it is maybe you can just ask the CFO or the CEO. Now, they're not always going to be very forward with some of this information. And so in the absolute worst case condition, if you do have a savings opportunity, let's just say that it's 100,000, and you can try to say, hey, look, this is what the EBITDA opportunity, but the enterprise value should really be 10, 15, 20x this. You know that number a little bit better than I do, but rather than think about this as a $100,000 opportunity, really think about it as the 2 million or 2.5 million that it deserves to be evaluated under. Okay, so that is kind of the what I would recommend if you have absolutely no information whatsoever.
Nicely done. A follow-up from Feroz, and you're on the right slide still. He wonders if the solutions that you describe play nicely with ERP systems.
Yes, they do. Coupa for sure does. Zycus have less knowledge, but I believe it does. And there are many other ones, by the way. Those are just the two that I'm kind of most familiar with. But I have never really heard issues with Coupa integrating with ERP systems. Not to say it doesn't exist, but everything I've heard is that it's an excellent platform.
Well, knowing you both, I'm going to make a point of introducing the two of you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Carl is in Toronto. Carl from Canada asks, why is or how is your approach to consulting as it relates to operational excellence and supply chain strategy different versus perhaps a bigger agency, something like a McKinsey or something like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's exactly what you see right here in front of you. I think most people, in fact, what they'll do is they'll just focus on one piece, one discipline. They'll go in, they'll just do a procurement strategy project. They'll do your 7-step or 5-step sourcing process, but they won't take the time to understand, can we eliminate some waste even before we get into this? And unless you've done both of them before, you won't even see it. You won't even know that there's waste that exists. And this is why I think we're a little bit different. Is we've had solid experience in operations excellence. We've had solid experience in procurement strategy. I mean, we're coming up with a procurement excellence approach simply because this has not been explored before. And I think that is really the differentiator. Many people spend all of their time in one discipline. Without having that cross discipline, it's really hard to understand where the value is in different spaces.
Mark asks, do you use the 21 keys of ops excellence and model it into procurement, supply chain, and IT ecosystem strategy?
21 keys of ops excellence, I'm less familiar with, but I do apply operations excellence methodologies such as the 8 sources of waste, the customer value add. There's 5S, there's SMED, and what I really like to do is actually work on how you translate those from sort of your plant floor into the procurement space or into the supply chain strategy space or into the office space. So that's what I end up doing, is looking at some of all the different tools. There's actually just I don't want to say hundreds, but tens and tens and tens of tools that Lean Six Sigma has produced. All of them are pretty well known, but they just packaged it in a very nice way. And so if you're able to look at those tools and then look at your procurement process, for example, and say, is there a way I can use this to help streamline and reduce the time it takes to actually find a vendor, solicit, and contract that vendor, then that's kind of what it is we look at, is how do we take these tools, apply it in a different space where it's not being applied. I'm not an IT guy, actually. I'm really not. I typically, I myself have other people on my team that are much more familiar from an IT space. So I'm not sure whether or how well operations excellence has been applied in the IT space itself.
Okay. That brings us to the top of the hour. You did a really solid job. I'm going to squeeze in one half a question. Mark asks if you would please spell Coupa and Zycus so he can do some online research for it.
Okay, Coupa is C-O-U-P-A, and Zycus is Z-Y-C-U-S.
I would not have guessed that. Everyone in your offices, just kind of do a silent, raising of the hands here. I'll put on my camera so you can see, like, we'll give Carlos a bit of the wave here about how good a job he did. That was a really nice presentation. As I promised, will forward the replay and all the slides and the transcript to everyone on this call. Carlos Suarez, the newest member of the Medical Devices Group Advisory Board, and I'm very pleased that he is a faculty member for our 10X Medical Device Conference at MDTX, which sponsored this presentation. Will be in 3 weeks, and I'll get to shake his hand in person. So I'm looking forward to that. Ask me for information if you are interested. Carlos and Joe, on behalf of the Medical Devices Group, see you next time. See you online.